The man at the counter was choking on his own pulse, and the nurse standing over him said the four words that still wake me up some nights. "Don't you move yet." I've been running calls out of that diner's parking lot for 6 years, and I thought I had the whole scene sized up before my boots hit the tile. Dispatch called it a possible cardiac combative. What I found was a big man in a faded fleece wedged against the counter stools, one hand jammed inside his jacket like he was guarding something, his eyes cutting to every door in the room the way men do when they've spent a year somewhere that taught them doors matter. And kneeling at arm's length from him, close enough to get hurt and not backing off an inch, was a nurse I only knew as the one they parked out of the walk-in clinic on Route 9, the post at County General where my partner liked to joke careers went to die. Her name was Nadia Castillo. I dropped patients at her clinic maybe a dozen times. Quiet, efficient, the kind of nurse a director assigns somewhere and forgets about. 3 weeks earlier, I'd heard Bellamy himself, the regional director, tell another nurse in the break room that Castillo was just filling a gap out there until budget allowed for someone permanent. I hadn't thought about her once since. I'm ashamed of that now. I should have thought about her sooner. 2 months back, I'd brought her a teenager seizing in the back of my rig, foaming, eyes rolled, the kind of call that usually ends with everybody guessing at a dosage and hoping. She'd looked at the boy for 4 seconds, asked his mother one question about a fish pond in the backyard, and called it as an organophosphate exposure before the on-call physician had even washed his hands. She was right. Nobody at County General mentioned it twice. A clinic nurse catching something a doctor missed wasn't the kind of story that traveled. Not in a building where the people deciding what counted as a story were the same people who decided she was disposable. "Sir, I need you to hear my voice and nothing else," she said, and her tone had a cadence to it I'd never heard a civilian nurse use. Flat, paced, almost military. "You're safe. I'm not reaching for you. I'm staying right here until you tell me I can move." The man's name, I'd learn later, was Cole Tanner. Discharged 8 months prior. A waitress had already backed away with both hands up like he might come apart. My partner, DeLuca, had his hand resting on his radio, ready to call for police backup the second Tanner's other hand moved. I didn't blame him. Tanner's face had gone the gray-white of the man whose heart was failing him in 2 directions at once. His jaw locked tight enough to crack a molar, sweat running clean lines down a face that hadn't shaved in days. "He's not tracking right." DeLuca muttered to me, low, the way you talk when you don't want the patient to hear the doubt in your voice. "I don't like this one, Bray. Something's off besides his heart." I didn't either. But Castillo had already closed the gap between herself and Tanner by another 6 inches, and neither of us moved to stop her because something about the stillness in her told us she knew exactly what kind of off this was. "Copy your 6, Tanner said. Just like that. 2 words, and something in his shoulders dropped half an inch. I'd never heard anyone talk a man down with a radio phrase before. Castillo didn't blink. "Copy," she said back, low and even. "I need eyes on your hand. Just your hand. Nothing else." He opened his jacket himself. No weapon. An EpiPen, crushed and spent, and a crumpled allergy card from the VA clinic he'd clearly ignored for months. His throat was closing. His pressure, when she finally got a cuff on him, was a number that should have already put him on the floor. "Anaphylaxis on top of a cardiac event," she said to me, without looking up, like she was reading off a chart instead of a man dying in front of a breakfast crowd. "He's bradycardic and his airways narrowing. I need your bag. Now." I'd handed bags to 100 people in my life and never once felt like the junior man in the room. I felt it then. She had my epinephrine out and dosed before I'd finished unzipping the second pouch, her hand steady in a way that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with having done this before in worse light with worse odds. For a moment, it looked like the dose hadn't been enough. His lips stayed blue at the edges. His breath came in a thin, wet whistle, and DeLuca's eyes found mine over the top of the monitor with a question neither of us said out loud. Castillo didn't look up. She repositioned his airway with 2 fingers, watched the rise of his chest for exactly 3 seconds, and called for a second line before either of us had finished worrying. She didn't flinch when his pulse dropped further on the monitor. She didn't raise her voice when DeLuca fumbled the leads a second time. She talked Tanner through every second of it in that same flat, paced voice, heart rate, oxygen, the names of the drugs going into him, like she was narrating a procedure to someone who needed the narration to stay calm, and I realized she was. She was keeping him present. She was keeping him from going somewhere in his head that would make him fight us, the same way she'd have kept a wounded man present on a hillside with no helicopter coming for hours. Stay with me, Tanner. Stay on this floor, in this diner with me. That's an order. It was the word order that did something to the room. A man 2 stools down, gray-bearded, a faded unit cap on the seat beside him, sat up straighter like he'd been called by name. Her bag had slid off her shoulder during the work and split open on the tile. An old canvas pouch, scuffed gray, nothing like the bright zippered kits the clinic issued. Gauze, a tourniquet, a battered brass clasp worn smooth except where a unit motto had been stamped deep enough to survive a decade of use. I caught a flash of it reaching for tape. I didn't think anything of it. I had a dying man to keep alive. It was the gray-bearded man who saw it for what it was. He'd come off his stool without a sound and crouched at the edge of the scene, not in the way, just close the way men do when they need to be near something they recognize. He looked at that class for a long 3 seconds. Then he looked at her hands working the rhythm of them, the way she called drugs and doses without checking a chart. Compass, he said. She didn't look up. Her hands didn't stop, but something in her shoulders went very still, the way Tanner's had gone still a few minutes earlier when she'd spoken his language back to him. You held the CCP at Wardak, the man said. It wasn't a question. 2 tours. I drove convoy out of the same forward op for 14 months, and every medic on that base knew the name Compass before they knew their own platoon sergeants. You kept 11 men breathing on a ridge with no air support and no resupply for 6 hours. I heard the story so many times I figured it was a legend somebody made up to keep us calm at night. It wasn't a legend, she said quietly, taping a line in place. It was a long 6 hours. Tanner's pulse came back under her hands before the second ambulance crew even got their gurney through the door. I watched his color change in real time, watched the gray drain out of his face the way water drains from a tub, and I understood for the first time in my career what people mean when they say someone brought a man back. Not metaphor, just true. The gray-bearded man. I learned his name was Master Sergeant Carl Reyes, retired, Tanner's old squad leader, on his way to pick the kid up for a Sunday he'd promised him weeks ago. Stood up slow, the way older men do when their knees have earned the right to take their time. He squared himself in the middle of that diner, between the counter and the door, and came to attention. Then he saluted her. I have work calls in courthouses and on battlefields of a smaller, civilian kind, and I have never seen a room go that quiet that fast. The waitress stopped where she stood. 2 off-duty soldiers at a corner booth. I hadn't even registered they were soldiers until that second. Just 2 young guys in flannel over their unit T-shirts. Rose without a word and stood at attention beside Reyes, hands at their sides, faces set. DeLuca froze with the monitor cable still in his hand. Nadia Castillo, on her knees on diner tile with a man's blood pressure cuff still wrapped around her own wrist, looked up at 3 men holding a salute for her and did not know what to do with her face for a second. Then she nodded, once the way you nod to someone you serve beside, and went back to checking Tanner's airway because the job wasn't finished and she had never once, in 6 minutes of crisis, let herself forget that. Director Bellamy walked in 11 minutes later. Somebody from the diner had called the clinic to report an incident involving clinic staff, and he'd come himself, the way administrators do when they smell a liability before they smell a miracle. He pushed through the door, already talking, something about protocol and unauthorized off-site intervention, a clipboard half-raised like he meant to start a write-up on the spot, and he stopped 3 feet inside when he saw a retired master sergeant still standing at the edge of attention and a county nurse stabilizing a patient on the floor with the calm of someone 20 years past needing to prove anything to anyone in that room. The clipboard came down slow, like it had gotten heavier in his hand. Reyes turned to him. "This is the nurse who held Wardak," he said, like it explained everything, because to every man standing in that diner it did. Held a casualty collection point alone for 6 hours on a ridge with no air support. 11 men. You understand what that means, son? Or you need me to spell out for you in front of these other two? Bellamy didn't say anything. I watched him try. His mouth opened once, and nothing came out. And he looked down at Castillo the way you look at something you've been walking past for a year without ever once seeing it clearly. He didn't apologize. He didn't make a speech. He just stood there while the paramedics loaded Tanner, while Reyes shook her hand with both of his and held it a beat too long to be casual, while the two young soldiers in flannel each came by to say something quiet to her before they left. I rode in with Tanner. Castillo stayed behind to give her statement, calm as ever, like she hadn't just had the better part of a decade's worth of silence broken open on a diner floor. I found out later, from DeLuca, who heard it from someone in billing, that Bellamy didn't say a word to her for the rest of that day. But the following morning, without any meeting, without any memo circulated for anyone else to read, he moved her off Route 9 and put her in charge of the overflow trauma team at County General, the post every nurse in that building had been angling for since before I started running calls there. Somebody told me he stood outside her new office for a full minute before he knocked, like he was rehearsing something he never ended up saying. He never explained it to anyone. He didn't have to. Every man who'd stood in that diner already knew why, and so did I. I think about that clasp sometimes, that worn brass stamp under 6 years of scuffing, sitting in a bag a director once called a Gap filler's bag, in a clinic he'd called a Gap. I think about how close that truth came to staying exactly where he'd filed it, out of sight, out of mind, until a man's heart gave out over breakfast and a stranger's voice carried far enough across a room to wake a memory that had been waiting 8 months for the right hands to find it. I think, too, about how she never once raised her voice to make any of us understand what we were watching. She didn't need volume. She had 6 hours on a ridge behind her and a man breathing in front of her, and that was the whole of her argument. I still run calls out past Route 9 sometimes, out of habit more than need now that the clinic's got someone new. I drive past the old building, and I think about a year's worth of mornings when nobody walking through that door knew what they were walking past. Some debts get repaid in ceremonies, with bands and flags and a stage somebody built for the occasion. Hers got repaid on cracked diner tile by a retired sergeant who still remembered a name whispered around a forward operating base a decade gone, and by two young soldiers who never said more than a few quiet words before they finished their coffee and went back out into a morning that no longer needed saving. She never told that story herself. Not once, not to me, not to anyone I ever heard. She didn't need to. The men who knew it told it for her, and it only ever needed telling once.